Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. Hello, hello. Happy Thursday. My name is Demetria. I'm the DEI scientist, and I really want to explore with you the science of DEI and how we can utilize these ideas and concepts as we are thinking through the world around us through a DEI lens. The science of DEI explores three big ideas. The first being that DEI is like chemistry, and I'm going to share a little bit more about that in this channel. DEI is a science, which we're going to explore in this video, and DEI, is within the sciences. There's diversity within the sciences, and all three of those things make up the science of DEI. And today I want to zero in and focus on one of those three things. I want to focus on the second one, how DEI is a science and how we can be more scientific in our implementation of DEI as leaders, as people within the community, as educators, and really just anyone who does this work on a day-to-day basis. So let's talk a little bit about something that I'm really excited and passionate about, and that I've been using in my own practice as I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion for multiple organizations, that I use in my training, that I utilize as a practitioner and a consultant. And that is the scientific method. You're probably familiar with the scientific method. Like, this is something that you learned about in your science classes, chemistry. You probably learned about it in biology, physics. You've learned the scientific method in a number of ways. And I feel like I started learning about it in middle school. But I have a kid in elementary school, and they are learning about it right now. And so I think that kids are learning about the scientific method earlier and earlier. And so this is a great way to take something that is very much accepted in the scientific community. We know that this process works if we work it correctly, and applying it to, social side of the world, arts, humanities, applying it in ways that are outside of the traditional sciences. And I think that there's power in doing that for a couple of reasons. One, it takes the guesswork out of it. If we're following a process like the scientific method, then everyone knows what to expect because everyone knows the scientific method. This is not something that's exclusive. Everyone has had to learn this. So it's a great way to get everyone on board. But also it makes it easy. It makes doing this work easy. And when it's easy, it's sustainable. So when I think about how to ensure that DEI, when I go into an organization and I say, okay, we're going to do DEI, and I don't just think about it for the time that I'm there. I mean, I might only be there for 6 months. I think about it for the times that I'm leaving. How do they continue doing this work even after I'm gone? Something like the scientific method ensures that there's a process that folks can continue to follow even after I'm gone, that everyone is already aware of. And I think that the scientific method helps us focus on the system and not necessarily the people. I think that those are two, in my mind, when I go into an organization, changing people, changing systems, those are two separate tasks. Those are two separate outcomes. It could take a lifetime to change people, but it doesn't take that long to change the system. And we can change the system in a relatively short amount of time. But changing people is a lot harder to do, a lot harder to measure, and a lot harder to make sustainable. So when I think about the scientific method, it checks a lot of boxes, which most things have to before I adopt them within the work that I do. And it makes sense for how to continue doing this work in the long term. So let's talk about the scientific method. There are a number of steps in the scientific method. So I'm going to go through each one, talk about it in the science sense, talk about it in the DEI through a DEI lens. First is observation. So oftentimes when I go into an organization, I learned this as I was studying for a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology. When you go into an organization and you're doing this work, I had a professor tell me, you want to be ninja-like. You want to be stealthy. You want to blend into the background. You don't want to stand out, because here's what happens. We all know this. If you have ever worked a job before, then you know this to be true. Someone from the outside comes in, or a leader from the corporate office comes in, or whatever, and you're being observed. Your behavior is completely different, right? All of a sudden, you're following the SOP to a T. Customer service is amazing. You're doing everything by the book. That's typically what happens when someone from the outside comes in, and you're being watched. I went to a store yesterday, and I was in the aisle with some workers who were restocking, and the manager came over to the worker and said, "Our manager is watching us through the cameras. So I need you to be on your game. I need you to be doing your best." And I thought to myself, they were doing their best. It's not like I needed any help or anything like that. I mean, they were stocking shelves that to me appeared to be fully stocked. So it's not like they weren't doing their job. However, when we think about the rules of the game, the playbook, being on their phone at any point during the shift is probably one of those rules that can't be broken. And so the manager was just reminding them, hey, we're being watched, so be on your P's and Q's. And I think that's what happens a lot of times when we get to that observation phase. When we start observing what's naturally happening, what's happening in the organization, in the school, in the community, we want to make sure that we're not disrupting what we're seeing. We want to see what's naturally occurring. I often think about, the person who has been with the company for 30 years and they're in charge of training someone new. And so, they go in and they're training the new person, and they say, okay, here's how they want you to do it, but here's how I do it. There's the way that we were taught to do it, the way that the man wants you to do it, and then there's the way that I have found shortcuts that work for me. And that's what I want to see. I want to see those shortcuts. I want to see how folks are making this environment work best for them, because that is going to give me a true sense of what is happening within the organization. It's going to help me take a picture of the current circumstances so that I can later analyze that so that we can decide how to move forward. So that piece, the observation piece, is really important so that you don't disrupt what's happening. The other piece is, as the person who is doing the observing, you want to reserve judgment, right? You don't want to go into the space and immediately start determining what's good and what's not good. You want to be able to take a full picture, and then at a later time, do the analyzing to determine, well, this is a gap, this is a strength, this is something that can continue, this is something that doesn't need to be continued. And I think that once you go into something knowing that you're not going to make a judgment call in the moment, it frees you to just look and to observe. It frees you from having to fix it in the moment, because that's not the goal. The goal is not to fix it, it's to observe. So that's the first step in the scientific method, is to observe. The second step is to ask questions. And I like to think of this as refining. So when we're observing, we're seeing everything, right? We're seeing the entire scope, the entire picture. When we are asking questions, we start to refine everything that we've seen. We start to narrow down our focus so that we can better understand, where do we need to focus our attention. And I like to think of it in two ways. What's working well that we need to be more intentional about doing, because sometimes the things that are working well kind of happen by accident. So how can we ensure that the things that are working well are being done purposefully? And then the things that aren't working well, how can we ensure that there is a solution to close the gap? And so both of those things happen when we start asking questions. We start to get curious and to better understand, how did we get to this point? And what I often find when I'm asking that question, like how did we get here, and doing so in a way that is non-judgmental, but really it's curious. I'm curious as to how we got to this point where this is the process, this is the culture. What I often find is that people open up, that they're ready to share how we got to this point. And there's always a valid reason, at least it might have been valid at the time, why things happened the way that they did. And I think that that's an important piece of this entire process, is understanding the history behind things before we try to implement change. And sometimes knowing how we got here prevents us from adding to the harm, or prevents us from getting to the help. And I want to make sure that as I'm facilitating change within organizations, that I'm not adding harm, that I'm increasing help. And so knowing how we got here is super important. With any change, within any lens, DEI, marketing, operations, you have to know how you got to that point before you can start facilitating change. It's very important. I do this even from a social perspective. So most of the time, what's happening within an organization, within a community, within a school system, is tied to something that is happening at a larger scale in society. And so knowing the history of what is happening at a societal level also helps inform us and ask those questions and be curious as we're going through the scientific method. So it's that the asking questions part is where we are kind of doing the work to better understand what it is that we're seeing, conceptualizing it, putting it into context, and kind of narrowing down what we're going to focus on. Which brings me to the third step of the scientific method, and that's the hypothesis. I feel like for the most part, steps one, the observation, step two, getting curious and asking questions. Those two things are happening at a relatively good kind of pace. Most folks who are doing this work, most leaders understand and recognize those two things. The hypothesis phase is where I often come into contact with people who want to boil the ocean. And if you think about the hypothesis in a science experiment, you're trying to find the solution for one thing. You're trying to close the gap on one thing. There is no one solution that at the hypothesis phase that you are anticipating is going to solve everything. In science, the hypothesis focuses on solving one thing. Once you've solved that one thing, then the results, can then be applied to many other things where the circumstances are similar. But that's not what you do in the hypothesis phase the first time. So remember, step one, observation. We're looking at everything. We're considering everything. Step two, asking questions, getting curious. We're taking everything that we saw and we're refining it and making it smaller. The hypothesis phase, we're taking everything that we have been curious about, everything that we are observing, and we have narrowed it down to one thing. And I know that this is super hard. It's hard for all the organizations that I work with to focus on one thing at a time. But it is super important to focus on one thing at a time, because that's how you get it right. That is how you take into consideration all the things that are happening around the one thing that you're focusing on and canceling them out. If you're trying to solve 15 things at a time, it's hard to tell, maybe if there's one thing that's working and one thing that's not working. It's very, very difficult to do that. So focusing on one thing at a time allows us to say whether or not that one thing is working. That kind of leads me to the next step. And that's experimentation. After we've made the hypothesis focused on the one thing, we start to experiment. And I think this is where a lot of folks can get really creative. And that's what that's what this work requires. It requires us to be creative as we're experimenting so that we can find solutions that actually work, and work in a way so that it doesn't cause more harm to everyone else. So while we're focused on this one thing, it's not like everything else, we're forgetting about. It's that we're understanding that while we're building this one thing, that all the other things at least can't be harmed any more than what they are. And if they're helped, even better. So the experimentation phase is where we can get creative, we can try new things, and we can see what works. That leads me to the next phase. And I guess I'll just say this before wrapping up the experimentation phase, is that your experiments are one thing at a time. You're testing one variable at a time, and you're not doing it all at once. Like, you are really focused on one thing at a time. So you're not boiling the entire ocean. You're not solving for everything. You've really narrowed it down. And then I think that this next part of the scientific method, at least how we utilize it within organizations, it is neck and neck with the experimentation phase. I mean, you go back and forth, and that is the analyzing the results phase. And I think that this starts to happen immediately in the experimentation phase, because a lot of the DEI experiments are not something that happens day one and then that's it, right? This is something that's happening for days and weeks and months at a time. And I forgot to mention this one thing about the experimentation phase. In the sciences, you have a time frame that these experiments are happening. You kind of know going into it that you are expecting to see some sort of reaction in the moment of the experiment. When we're doing experiments within organizations, within communities, we have to set a deadline so that the experiment doesn't go on forever. So the experiment could be 18 months. We could say, okay, we're going to experiment within this space for 18 months. That's our deadline. And going into it, we're going to set goals. We're going to set, measures of accountability. We're going to ensure that we know what our outcome will be, because that's what we're working towards. We're thinking about the end, keeping the end in mind. We're starting with the end in mind. And so I think that that's a really important, step of the experimentation phase, is that it is an experiment. And, based on your results, it may move from the experiment phase to this is just how we work. But we have to ensure that there is a deadline to the experiment so that we know whether or not it's working. Okay, so now let's go on to the analysis phase. When we're analyzing the results, I think of the analysis in two separate buckets. The one bucket says we're doing an analysis of the results from a scientific perspective. We're looking at data. We're making sure that the goals that we had, we are measuring movement towards those goals. That is something that is very data-driven, data-focused, right? So that's the first way. Most folks that are doing this work get the data piece. The other thing that I focus on as I'm doing this work is the perception. That's also something that has to be managed as part of this work. So I'll give two examples. You've experimented, you are, knee deep in the experiment, in the implementation, whether it's a program, it's an initiative, whatever the case, you're knee deep in it. And you're finding that the data, it supports continuing in doing the experimentation, right? You're 6 months into it. You gave yourself an 18-month deadline. At the 6-month mark, you are almost at the goals that you set before going into the experiment. You're well on your way. However, there's a folks internally and externally who don't perceive that this particular initiative or program to be working. And oftentimes, the reason why the perception and the reality, why there's not alignment there for some people, is because of a lack of communication. There's no communication about, Here's what we are expecting from this experiment. And then as the experiment is happening, here are the results. That's not happening to this group who perceive that nothing is happening. So that's the first mismatch, is the reality of what is happening is not the perception that some folks have of what's happening. The second is the reverse. So you got folks who perceive that what is happening, it is working. They love it. They think that it should continue, and it's great work. Keep going. And then you have the reality that shows this is not working. It is a huge drain on resources. We are not getting towards any closer to the goals that we set. And even with the adjustments that we are making, we're not going to get there. We probably need to abandon this and move on to the next experiment. And oftentimes, again, there's a misalignment when it comes to the communication piece. But I think what's most important here is making sure that the people who are, talking about and having these perceptions are included in the process, the scientific method, to ensure that they understand what is happening, what the goals are, and if you're getting any closer to that. So in all aspects of the data analysis and in the communication is something that is, not a big part of the scientific method, but I think is a big part of, if we were to apply the scientific method to how we do DEI work, communication would be at each step. Having that communication between the two groups is super important. Measuring it in two different ways is so important. So, is this working from a data perspective? Is this working from a perception perspective? And if those two things align, then you've done a great job from a communications perspective, and everyone is on the same board, same page. So, as you're analyzing the data, you'll want to ensure, and the reaction, you'll want to ensure that you have some milestones set up. So it might be, we are 2 weeks into this. Let's, get a pulse of how things are working. We're a month into this new program or new initiative. Let's get a pulse and see how things are working. I always recommend, give something like 18 months, because most of the time you're going to see all the seasons in that 18-month period. You're going to see if the organization has periods where there's slow times, or there's really busy times, then you'll see what happens with this particular program during all of those seasons. But you'll also give yourself time that if by the 12-month mark, you're not seeing the progress that you want to make, you'll have 6 months to say, okay, we need to phase this out because it's not working. This experiment is not working. The adjustments that we've made, which is the last step of the scientific method, are not working. And we need to move on. It gives you time to formulate what the communication plan looks like for that, which, if you're communicating regularly about what's working and what's not working, then the internal stakeholders and even the external stakeholders will be able to see and understand why you're moving on from what you're moving on from. So that gives you 6 months to formulate your communication plan, but it also gives you some time to start the process all over again of, okay, let's do some more observation. Let's ask some more questions. Let's form a hypothesis. Let's start, diving into what that experiment looks like. So by the time that 18-month period happens, you're ready to move forward. You might even be ready to move on to the next experiment before then. But you've at least given yourself a little bit of cushion to say, yes, it's work. If it's not working, we're ready to move on. We're ready to wind this down and then move on to something else. You might, and the time frame depends on the organization. You might give yourself 2 years. I would say no less than 18 months though. And also you don't want to give yourself 10 years, right? You want to, because we're shifting the system. And when we're shifting the system, we should be able to start seeing movement immediately. It's not something that's going to take 15 years for us to be able to see. We should start seeing things happening quite rapidly. So as you're thinking through kind of what that looks like, plan for at least 18 months, utilizing the last 6 months if things aren't working to change gears. If things are working, then I say that last 6 months is to move from experimentation phase to this is just how we work. It's just how we work. And oftentimes, if you are changing something within the system, then you've had some time to figure out how do we build this into how we work, or how does this change how we work. If it's a program, for example, then the next phase might be, okay, it worked for this one group, closing the gap. How do we apply this to others so that we can also close gaps that they may be experiencing? And that's where some adjustments may need to be made. When thinking about that, I approach it in two different ways. The control group or the experimentation group. That can be looked at from a top-down perspective, right? So if we think about the periodic table of elements, each one of those elements can be your experimentation group, right? As you're thinking about programs, initiatives, things like that. But there also could be, and I think of that as like a top-down approach. There also could be a bottom-up approach that looks at the intersection of multiple identities that will narrow the participants in your group, but the results you may be able to apply to the various groups that are part of that intersection. Let me illustrate. So top down is one of the elements on the table of diversity. Let's just say top down is women. You have a particular program or initiative that you are applying to all women, right? So we're hoping that this helps across the board. There are pros and cons to that. I won't get into that in this video. The other approach is bottom up. And that's when you're looking at the intersection. So it could be that the group, in order to be a part of this experimentation group, it have to be women, women of color, women with disabilities, women of color with disabilities, and women of color with disabilities who are in a certain level within the organization, right? So that will significantly make your population, your experiment group, smaller. But what sometimes happens is, you find something that works for this group, and then you can see, does it also work for women overall? Does it also work for people of color overall? Does it also work for people with disabilities? Does it also work for, all people within this level of the organization? So sometimes you can generalize those results to positively impact others. But that has to be part of a very conscious decision as part of the experimentation phase. You can't necessarily do that after the fact. So if you just thought about doing something for women, you then can't say, okay, well, we did this and it worked for women. Let's see if we can also do this for people with disabilities, because that doesn't work. What people with disabilities need is going to be significantly different than than women might need, and vice versa. And that's the same across the board with so many different groups. So you have to be very conscious of that as you're designing the experimentation phase. And so the final piece of that is adjustment. And I honestly think that experimentation, analyzing the results, and adjustment, that is a continuous loop that just keeps happening. You're experimenting. As you're experimenting, you're looking at the results and you're making those minor adjustments along the way. And it's incredibly important to be open to making these adjustments along the way. It's not changing things overall. It's just making adjustments. This particular process is second nature to me for a number of reasons. One, I think I just, in science classes, in chemistry, I held on to that because it made sense in my mind. As I was studying for my master's degree in instructional design, there's a very similar process that we are taught to use as we are developing, learning materials. And that process is ADDIE. It's an acronym. It's analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. And that 5-step process very much overlaps with the scientific method. So it was further ingrained into me that this is a process that works. It's a scientific process that is validated across multiple disciplines that works. And then even as I started studying for my PhD in industrial and organizational psychology, there were so many subtle nods to this process that it just was further ingrained into how I problem solve. And so this being the foundation, this is how I go into every single organization: observe, getting curious and asking questions, making a hypothesis, experimentation, analyzing results, and making adjustments. That's how I work, and that is what I teach as I'm doing this work. And uh, to know that it's scientific and it helps make DEI more scientific is something that I think makes this work even more sustainable. So that's it. That's the scientific method and how it applies through a DEI lens. And I think that any leader could utilize this. It could be a teacher, it could be a leader within an organization, it could be a community leader. It even parents, I think, could utilize this as you are trying to understand how to meet your kids exactly where they are to give them exactly what they need so that they can thrive. And I just think it's a great, very scientific way to balance our facts and feelings, which are both very necessary in this work that we're doing. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know if this kind of run through made sense. And if you could see applying this within your own work. Talk to you soon. Bye.